476 people boarded, 304 died, 5 have still not been found. This was one of the worst maritime disasters in South Korean history, and it could have been avoided. But after the tragedy, an even more terrifying rumor began to spread. Some said it wasn't an accident, but something connected to a cult. In 2014, more than 300 second-year students from Danwon High School set off for a 4-day school trip to Jeju Island. On the evening of April 15th, a sudden dense fog delayed departures at Incheon port, until one ferry was cleared to leave, the Sewol. Guided by the crew, the students went up to the 4th deck. The empty rooms on that deck were reserved specifically for Danwon High School students. The teachers stayed on the 5th deck with the crew, while other passengers were assigned to the 3rd deck. Each room had 8 beds arranged as bunk beds. The corridors were somewhat narrow, and there were no extra furnishings. At 9 p.m., Sewol slowly departed Incheon port. At 8:30 the next morning, the voyage was already more than halfway complete, and the ferry would reach Jeju Island in 2 hours. At 8:48, the students inside the cabins suddenly felt a violent jolt. Then, the cargo containers stacked on the deck were flung into the sea. After the shaking lasted for several dozen seconds, the ship still did not regain its balance. The entire vessel then listed 30 degrees to the left. Passengers eating breakfast on the 3rd deck fell to the floor like dominoes, one after another. Inside the cabins, passengers and luggage were thrown to one side, and it was almost impossible to stand. The corridors were filled with fallen passengers, and many people were injured. Then Choi Deok-ha, a Danwon High School student, was in the corridor on the 4th deck. He was thrown to the ground by the sudden jolt. Realizing something was wrong, he quickly dialed the emergency number. Choi was usually a very calm boy. He forced himself to suppress his fear and described what was happening on board to the operator as clearly as he could. Choi was the first person on the Sewol to send a distress call to the authorities, earlier even than the crew. As Choi was calling for help, the announcement system on the ship came on. These words were replayed repeatedly within the first hour of the disaster. Minutes after Choi's call, the chief mate finally sent a distress message, and only after several relays did it reach the Mokpo Coast Guard. Inside the cabins, students were panicking and didn't know what to do. Classmates who had fallen struggled to get back on their feet, leaning against the walls, and the announcement telling everyone to stay where they were also calmed the students slightly. Within the first half hour, the ship's list grew worse, past 50 degrees, yet no coordinated rescue had begun. What was hard to understand was that the announcement on the Sewol, the line telling everyone to remain where they were, was still being repeated. The broadcast also emphasized that the teachers and students of Danwon High School should not act rashly. Other than that, there were no further instructions. Around 9 a.m., a red oil tanker, the Dula Ace, reached the scene, but floating containers blocked it from getting close. As close as it could possibly get, the ship's captain provided life jackets and lifeboats. It was within arm's reach, but the Sewol's crew did not organize any evacuation. Not a single person was on the huge deck. 5 minutes after arriving, the Dula Ace reported the situation to the Jindo VTS Center, and the VTS Center continued to demand that the Sewol's crew evacuate the passengers. But Chief Mate Kang Won-sik said the broadcast system had malfunctioned. He also said there were too many passengers, and that he worried that if they evacuated, they might not be rescued. Even after receiving repeated assurances from the Jindo VTS Center, the crew still did not organize an evacuation. Instead, they continued to tell passengers to remain inside the cabins. 2 minutes later, the Jindo VTS Center again demanded that Sewol's captain, Lee Jun-seok, immediately decide whether to evacuate. But Captain Lee did not respond. He only kept repeating the condition of the ship. During this period, the communications officer used the announcement system multiple times to tell passengers not to move. More civilian boats began to gather, but no clear order came from the Sewol. The same message kept repeating, "Stay where you are." Then the situation suddenly collapsed. Water broke into the lower decks, the tilt accelerated, and the ship's final reports cut off. By then, 3 Coast Guard officers in a small inflatable boat carefully maneuvered around the floating containers and approached the Sewol. 10 minutes later, the inflatable boat successfully came alongside the Sewol's deck. They rescued the first group of people trapped on board, but they were not passengers. They were 8 crew members, including Captain Lee. By around 10 a.m., the Sewol was already nearly on its side. Most students still stayed inside, obeying the announcement. A few fought their way out, climbing along hoses, crawling through tilted corridors, just to reach open air. That was when a fisheries patrol officer, Park Seong-gi, arrived and was stunned. Dozens of boats were nearby, yet few were moving in. He drove straight toward the ship and began pulling people out himself. The fisheries patrol vessel had its warning lights on. When the more than 20 nearby civilian fishing boats saw this, they thought a government rescue vessel had begun operations, and only then did they move in toward the Sewol to start rescuing people. Over the next 15 minutes, these civilian fishing boats rescued 120 people in succession, far more than the number rescued by the official forces. At 10:15 a.m., some passengers made it onto the deck. By then, the Sewol was already listing beyond 90 degrees and was about to roll over. These passengers summoned the courage to jump into the freezing seawater and were rescued. At 10:17 a.m., the Sewol rolled completely over. Only the starboard side remained above the surface. Seawater flooded the 4th deck, where 40 students had been waiting. They seized their last chance to escape, and with the current, they swam with all their strength toward the surrounding vessels. All of them were rescued, but the remaining students were not so fortunate. Their cabin doors could not be opened due to water pressure, and they lost their final chance to escape. After overturning, the Sewol began to sink slowly, and any vessel or person that came too close could be pulled in if they were not extremely careful. At 10:18 a.m., the Coast Guard began controlling the area and did not allow any vessels to approach. 92 minutes after the accident began, the Sewol was completely overturned. Fisheries Patrol Officer Park Seong-gi kept scanning the surrounding waters, but he did not see any passengers. Just as he turned to leave, he suddenly heard someone calling for help behind him. He saw a male student wearing a life jacket, shouting with all his strength. The student was very close to the Sewol and could be pulled back in at any moment. Risking his life, Park Seong-gi turned back and rushed toward him, rescuing him. In the few minutes as the Sewol sank, Park Seong-gi rescued the last survivor. He was Park Jun-hyuk, a student from Danwon High School. When the ship overturned, Jun-hyuk was still inside and had not escaped. He held onto a female student and fought his way forward against the rushing water. Inside the ship, everything was upside down, and there was no way to tell where the exit was. As the cabin was about to fill completely, he decided to risk everything. The two took a deep breath and dove into the water, but the currents caused by the ship sinking tore them apart. After more than 10 seconds underwater, Park was fortunate enough to break free from the ship and slowly rise to the surface, while the girl disappeared into the sea. 58 minutes after the capsize, at 11:18 a.m., the vessel was almost completely submerged, with only the blue bow still visible above the water. At 10 a.m. on the day of the disaster, as passengers began trying to escape with all their strength, South Korean President Park Geun-hye had already received a report about the incident. But she did not appear in public for about 7 hours. Around 11 a.m., officials reported to the Blue House that there were no casualties. MBC aired it first, and other outlets repeated it, an error that lasted nearly an hour. Some parents, hearing that their children had all been rescued, cried with joy. They kept trying to reach their children by phone, but received no replies. Very quickly, they realized something was wrong. After the false news was exposed, public opinion deteriorated rapidly. The Central Disaster and Safety Countermeasures Headquarters, which had provided the false information, admitted that they did not actually know what was happening on the ship. Meanwhile, rescue efforts were still unfolding in chaos. At 12:04 p.m., the Republic of Korea Navy's Maritime Salvage and Rescue Unit arrived at the scene, but they had no diving equipment and could not conduct underwater rescue. They could only wait around the Sewol. At 1:42 p.m., the Korea Coast Guard's Deep-Sea Diving Special Rescue Team arrived late, but due to tidal conditions, rescue operations still did not begin. At 5:15 p.m., President Park finally appeared. She was completely unaware that hundreds of students were trapped inside the ship, and she was astonished that the rescue had made no progress. After arriving at the Ministry of Security and Public Administration building in Seoul, she even asked, "I heard the students all put on life jackets. Are they really that hard to find?" Clearly, she still had not realized the severity of the situation. That evening, the first underwater search finally began, with only a handful of divers. Later that night, rescuers recovered bodies, and one student was found alive, but he didn't survive. Throughout the night, the Coast Guard controlled the area and did not allow anyone to approach on their own. Officials claimed that more than 500 divers had been dispatched to take part in the rescue, but parents said there was not a single diver around the Sewol. The media reported that a total of 14 bodies were recovered that day. 2 days after the disaster, the entire ship sank completely. More and more civilian divers could not sit still. They applied one after another to join the rescue, but they were all stopped by the Coast Guard. They could not even sail their boats in. The relevant authorities and the media kept releasing false news and then kept overturning it. The search continued until November 11th. 209 days after the disaster, the search was declared over. Of the 476 people on board the Sewol, only 172 were rescued. The remaining 304 all died or went missing, including Choi, the Danwon High School student who had been the first to send a distress call to the outside world. This disaster also became the most serious maritime disaster in South Korean history. Years later, the hull was raised intact, but with key AIS data missing, the argument over what truly happened never fully ended. After the disaster, investigators focused on what could actually explain the capsize. Their conclusion pointed to a deadly combination: severe cargo overload, insufficient ballast water, and structural modifications that raised the ship's center of gravity. When the vessel made a sudden turn, the cargo shifted, stability was lost, and the list quickly became unrecoverable. Online, other rumors spread too. Some claimed the anchor had been deliberately dropped. Others insisted the Sewol was struck by an external object, even a submarine. But after the hull was raised and examined, there were no clear signs strong enough to support those claims. If the disaster happened because of cargo overload, ship modifications, and a sudden, abnormal turn, then what followed after the accident from the captain, the crew, and the relevant authorities is chilling to the bone. Human wrongdoing was the fundamental reason more than 300 passengers died. First, the captain and crew repeatedly received clear instructions telling them to organize passengers, have them put on life jackets, and evacuate immediately. At that time, the ship's list was still not severe. If passengers had been evacuated in time, casualties could have been minimized to the greatest extent. But the captain and crew cared only about saving themselves, completely disregarding the lives and safety of the passengers. Even after receiving those instructions, the crew still told passengers to remain where they were, while they themselves escaped onto lifeboats. Captain Lee was resting in his room when it happened. Only after hearing the disturbance did he climb up to the top deck. When he was rescued, he was even wearing only a long-sleeve shirt and shorts. As the people who understood the Sewol's condition best, after evacuating successfully, they still did not assist rescuers in carrying out a rescue. Chief Mate Kang once refused the evacuation order from the Jindo VTS Center, saying there were too many passengers on board, and it was impossible to evacuate everyone. In reality, the Sewol was equipped with 44 small lifeboats, each able to carry 25 people. There were also 4 marine evacuation systems, each able to accommodate 250 people. These devices could allow 2,100 people to escape. The total number of people on the Sewol at the time was 476. If the rescue had been properly organized, there was absolutely a chance for everyone to be saved. But after the accident, only 2 lifeboats were used. The VTS Center repeatedly emphasized that as long as passengers jumped into the water, nearby ships could guarantee their rescue. But no passengers received such an instruction. Instead, all they heard, over and over, was the announcement telling them to stay where they were. The actions of the Korea Coast Guard were extremely passive, and they also prevented civilian volunteers from approaching the scene, causing rescue efforts to fail to begin in time. According to footage provided by the Fisheries Patrol vessel, before the Sewol capsized, you could barely see any Coast Guard presence. After rescuing the captain and crew, the Coast Guard began to stand by and watch. Instead, it was Park Seung-gi and civilian fishing boats that arrived later who led the rescue. If not for them, even more passengers would have died. During the rescue of the crew, one Coast Guard officer climbed a fire hose into the bridge. This was the last chance to use the announcement system to warn passengers to evacuate, but the Coast Guard only rescued the crew. As public anger continued to grow, a fourth theory, filled with conspiracy claims, began to spread: a cult's human sacrifice. The most widely circulated version in South Korea linked it to Choi Tae-min, the leader of the Church of Eternal Life. Choi Tae-min was the father of Choi Soon-sil, President Park's close friend, and he had known President Park for a long time. Choi Soon-sil was the central figure in the 2016 influence peddling scandal. Choi Tae-min died in 1994, and before his death, he once claimed that he would be reborn 20 years later. The Sewol sinking happened in 2014, exactly 20 years after his death. Because of this, some people believe that the more than 300 deaths on the Sewol were rebirth offerings arranged by Choi Soon-sil, using her close relationship with President Park for her father, Choi Tae-min. There were rumors that President Park already knew about the sinking and that her missing 7 hours were spent performing a ritual for Choi Tae-min. However, in 2018, prosecutors said there was no evidence she was receiving cosmetic injections or performing a ritual during that time. The Sewol's operating company, the Chonghaejin Marine Group, had deep ties to another sect, the Evangelical Baptist Church of Korea. Its president, Yoo Byung-yoon, was closely connected to that group. He belonged to a South Korean new religious movement known as Guwonpa, and as early as 1992, the group was declared heretical by the Korean Presbyterian Church. Yoo Byung-yoon was a direct disciple of the sect's founder, and many of the company's crew members were also believers in the sect. This sect was also linked in public memory to the Odayang incident in 1987, which resulted in 32 deaths, and the two characters Sewol, personally chosen by Yoo Byung-yoon, were also seen as carrying religious meaning. Before the incident, the Sewol's original captain had repeatedly reported problems with the ship's stability, but the company suspended him. The company then temporarily assigned Captain Lee as the acting captain for this voyage, which further fueled public suspicion, with some people believing the Sewol disaster was part of Yoo Byung-yoon's plot. After the disaster, Yoo Byung-yoon was placed on a wanted list on charges including embezzlement. Police deployed 6,000 officers to search for him. 2 months after the Sewol disaster, in June 2014, South Korean police announced that Yoo Byung-yoon's body had been found in a field in Suncheon, South Jeolla Province. The body was severely decomposed, and the cause of death could not be determined, but dental records and DNA testing confirmed that it was Yoo Byung-yoon. His bizarre death undoubtedly added an eerie and mysterious layer to the entire incident. After the Sewol was salvaged, a large number of animal remains were also found inside, which led many people to believe the sacrifice theory. In fact, those animal remains were pig bones, mainly because some of the trucks on board contained food waste, not so-called religious ritual remains. In November 2015, more than a year after the Sewol disaster, the case reached a final trial at the Supreme Court, ruled that Captain Lee Jun-seok was guilty of homicide for failing to act, and sentenced to life in prison. The other 15 surviving crew members were sentenced to prison terms ranging from 1 year and 6 months to 12 years. According to testimony from surviving students, 3 crew members stayed behind during the incident, refused to abandon the passengers, and did everything they could to help people until the very last moment. Tragically, all 3 of those crew members died in the disaster. After the final ruling, a total of 53 people were found guilty. Besides the crew, this also included personnel from agencies such as the Korea Coast Guard and the Chonghaejin Marine Company. In January 2016, nearly 2 years after the disaster, Danwon High School held a special graduation ceremony for the students who had died. The desks were covered with flowers and photographs, commemorating lives that had once been as bright as flowers. The surviving students returned to Jeju Island, carrying photos of their classmates who did not make it, completing the school trip that never truly began.